"Is this your doing, Chief?" bellowed Ben Carter, his wheelchair screeching as he spun to face the towering figure of Police Chief Donald Grant. The courtroom fell silent. All eyes were fixed on the frail, yet defiant man with steel in his gaze, sitting before a stunned jury. In his trembling hand, Ben held a photo, one that hadn't been presented by either side during the trial. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Ben slammed the photo onto the prosecutor's table. "Explain this." His voice shook, not from fear but righteous fury. The image depicted a pair of boots, black, polished, and smeared with blood, lying in the trunk of what appeared to be the chief's personal vehicle. The same boots described by witnesses as being worn by the masked man who assaulted a teenager 6 months earlier. Chief Grant's face went pale, his lips parting as if to object, but no words came out. Murmurs turned to shouts as the judge pounded his gavel, demanding order. The jury exchanged alarmed glances while the defense attorney scrambled through papers, visibly unnerved. Ben's eyes locked with the chief's, his voice a low growl. "You thought you could bury the truth, but it's not buried anymore." Months earlier, life for Ben Carter had been simpler. As a retired high school teacher and single father, his world revolved around his daughter, Emily, a vibrant 17-year-old with dreams of becoming a lawyer. Their small suburban neighborhood in the heart of Ohio was peaceful, or so it seemed. One crisp autumn evening, Emily failed to return home after visiting a friend. Panic crept into Ben's chest as hours stretched into the early morning. Calls to Emily's phone went unanswered. Frantic, he reached out to her friends, but none had seen her since she'd left them all. The local police department, led by Chief Donald Grant, seemed oddly unmotivated. "Teenagers wander off all the time," Chief Grant had said dismissively when Ben filed a report. "She'll come back when she's ready." But Emily didn't come back. Days turned into weeks, and Ben's frustration grew. He plastered the town with missing posters, organized search parties, and appeared on local news stations pleading for help. Still nothing. Then one bitter November morning, Ben received a call. Emily's body had been found in a shallow ditch near an abandoned lot. The cause of death was blunt force trauma. His world crumbled. At the funeral, amidst condolences and tearful embraces, Ben noticed something peculiar. Chief Grant attended, standing at the back, avoiding eye contact. The man's behavior struck Ben as odd, almost guilty. Unable to shake his suspicions, Ben began his own investigation. Despite being wheelchair-bound since a car accident years ago, he combed through every shred of information he could find, from police reports to news articles. It wasn't long before inconsistencies surfaced. Witnesses had seen a man leaving the area where Emily's body was found. They described his clothing, a dark hoodie and heavy boots. Yet none of this was in the police report. Ben's tenacity led him to the most shocking discovery of all, a grainy photo sent anonymously to his email. It showed boots matching the description, stained with what appeared to be blood, inside the trunk of a car. The license plate was partially visible, and it belonged to Chief Grant. Back in the courtroom, Ben's heart pounded as he watched the reactions unfold. His decision to confront Chief Grant directly had been risky, but he had nothing to lose. For months, the trial had been a farce, with the prosecution's evidence dismissed as circumstantial and key witnesses mysteriously retracting their statements. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he examined the photo. "Mr. Carter, where did you get this?" he asked. Ben hesitated, debating whether to protect his source. "It was sent to me by someone who knows the truth," he said finally. "Someone who wanted justice for Emily." The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence wasn't submitted during discovery. It's inadmissible." The judge frowned. "We'll take a brief recess while I review this matter." "Bailiff, escort Chief Grant to chambers for questioning." As the room emptied, Ben felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since Emily's death. But his relief was short-lived. Minutes later, a piercing scream echoed from the direction of the judge's chambers. Ben's blood ran cold. What now? Ben's hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair as chaos erupted in the courtroom. People darted toward the source of the scream, Judge Peterson's chambers, while others stood frozen in shock. Emily's photo, now crumpled on the prosecutor's table, seemed to mock him. The truth had finally surfaced, but something darker was unfolding. The bailiff returned moments later, pale and trembling. "Call an ambulance," he shouted, sending a ripple of panic through the room. "Wait!" Ben wheeled himself forward, his voice cracking. "What happened in there? Is the judge okay?" The bailiff didn't answer, brushing past him as paramedics rushed in. The courtroom emptied into the hallway, where whispers and gasps spread like wildfire. Someone said the judge collapsed. A woman murmured to her neighbor. "No, I heard it was Chief Grant. He's not breathing," another replied. Ben's chest tightened. Was this some desperate attempt by Grant to dodge accountability, or was there something more sinister at play? He maneuvered his wheelchair toward the commotion, pushing against the flow of the crowd. When he reached the judge's chambers, the scene was surreal. Chief Grant lay on the floor, his face blue and contorted. EMTs hovered over him, performing CPR while shouting medical commands. Judge Peterson sat in his chair, visibly shaken, clutching his chest but conscious. "What happened?" Ben demanded, addressing one of the officers outside the door. The officer hesitated, then leaned closer. "Looks like the chief had a heart attack. But here's the thing. Someone slipped a note onto the judge's desk right before it happened." "A note?" Ben's mind raced. "What did it say?" "I don't know. They won't let anyone touch it until forensics gets here," the officer replied, glancing nervously back into the room. Ben's eyes narrowed. A heart attack? The timing was too convenient. He had spent months uncovering Chief Grant's secrets, and just as the man was cornered, this happened? It didn't feel like a coincidence. The paramedics eventually lifted Grant onto a stretcher, wheeling him out toward the ambulance. Ben followed, his wheels squeaking against the tiled floor. As they passed, he caught a glimpse of Grant's face, still, lifeless, and somehow relieved. Was this his escape? Had someone helped him? The following days brought more questions than answers. The courtroom proceedings were postponed, leaving Ben in a state of restless limbo. News of Chief Grant's sudden death spread quickly, igniting debates on social media. Some mourned the chief, painting him as a hero who had served the community for decades. Others hinted at the darker truths Ben had uncovered, wondering if justice had finally caught up to him. Meanwhile, Ben continued digging. He couldn't shake the feeling that the note left for Judge Peterson held the key to understanding what had happened. When he called the courthouse for updates, he was stonewalled. "The investigation is ongoing," the clerk told him curtly. "We're not at liberty to discuss the contents of the note." Frustrated but undeterred, Ben turned to an unlikely ally, Megan Walters, a junior reporter who had covered Emily's disappearance early on. Megan had always been skeptical of the police narrative and had followed Ben's case closely. When he shared his suspicions about the note, she agreed to help. Over coffee at a quiet diner, Megan slid a folder across the table. "This is everything I've got on Chief Grant," she said. "It's not much, but it might help." Ben flipped through the pages, scanning old newspaper clippings, court records, and personnel files. One detail jumped out: a pattern of internal complaints against Grant for questionable practices. Most were dismissed without investigation, but one stood out. It involved a whistleblower, a young officer who had accused Grant of covering up evidence in a prior case. "What happened to this officer?" Ben asked, pointing to the file. Megan hesitated. "He left the force under mysterious circumstances. Word is, he moved out of state and changed his name. No one's heard from him since." Ben felt a spark of hope. "If we can find him, maybe he can confirm what I already suspect." Megan nodded, pulling out her phone. "I'll see what I can do." That evening, Ben returned home to find a package on his doorstep. It was unmarked, with no return address. Unease crept over him as he carefully opened it. Inside was a single USB drive, along with a note written in block letters. "Keep digging. The answers are closer than you think." Ben stared at the drive, his pulse quickening. Who had sent this? And why? He inserted the drive into his laptop, half expecting it to contain nothing but malware. Instead, a folder popped up labeled Truth. Inside were surveillance videos, audio recordings, and more photos, each implicating Chief Grant in a web of corruption far deeper than Ben had imagined. bribery, witness intimidation, evidence tampering. It was all there. One video in particular made his blood run cold. It showed Emily. She was alive, arguing with someone just out of frame. "I know what you did," she shouted. "You can't get away with this." The video ended abruptly, leaving Ben trembling with rage. Before he could process what he'd seen, his phone buzzed. An unknown number flashed across the screen. Against his better judgment, he answered. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Carter," a distorted voice said. "If you value your life, stop now." The line went dead. Ben sat in stunned silence, gripping the phone as his mind raced. He was closer to the truth than ever before. But at what cost? Suddenly, the lights in his house flickered. A loud bang echoed from outside. Ben wheeled himself to the window, peering through the blinds. His heart sank. A car idled at the end of his driveway, its headlights piercing the darkness. Two figures stepped out, their faces obscured by shadows. One held a crowbar. Ben's hand instinctively reached for his phone, but before he could dial 911, the front door rattled violently. The men were trying to break in. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The door shuddered under the weight of the crowbar. Ben's hands trembled as he wheeled himself backward, scanning the room for anything that could be used as a weapon. The house was quiet, the only sound being the splintering wood as the men forced their way in. Bang! The door burst open, slamming against the wall. Ben's pulse raced as the two intruders stepped inside. They wore dark hoodies, their faces obscured by masks. One carried the crowbar, while the other clutched a flashlight that cast eerie shadows across the room. "Search the place," the man with the crowbar barked. His voice was low and gravelly. Ben didn't wait for them to spot him. He turned his wheelchair toward the hallway and rolled as fast as his arms would allow. He needed to reach the study, where he kept a stun gun locked in a drawer. His tires squeaked against the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed deafening in the tense silence. "Did you hear that?" one of the men said, his flashlight sweeping the room. Ben reached the study, slamming the door behind him. His fingers fumbled with the lock, but it clicked into place just as footsteps approached. He wheeled himself toward the desk, yanked open the drawer, and grabbed the stun gun. His hand steadied slightly as he held the device, its weight both reassuring and terrifying. Bang! The doorknob rattled violently, followed by the sound of a boot slamming against the door. The wood creaked under the pressure. Ben's mind raced. He couldn't fight them off for long. He needed help. He reached for his phone, dialing Megan. The line rang twice before she picked up. "Ben? It's late." "What's—" "They're here," he hissed. "Two men, they broke into my house. I need help." "Stay on the line," Megan said, her voice sharp with urgency. "I'm calling the police. Just hang tight." The door splintered as the crowbar punched through, sending chunks of wood flying. Ben gripped the stun gun tightly, aiming it at the gap. His heart pounded in his ears as the door gave way, revealing the masked intruders. "There he is," one of them shouted. Ben pressed the trigger. The stun gun crackled as a blue arc of electricity shot toward the man with the crowbar, hitting him square in the chest. He dropped the weapon with a grunt, collapsing to the floor in spasms. The second man lunged at Ben, shoving the wheelchair backward. Ben slammed into the wall, the air knocked out of him. The stun gun skittered across the floor, just out of reach. "You should have left it alone," the man growled, his voice trembling with anger. He grabbed Ben by the collar, yanking him forward. Ben fought back, his fists flailing against the man's grip. "Who sent you?" he spat, his voice defiant despite the fear clawing at him. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised his fist, but before he could strike, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the window as police cars screeched to a halt outside. "Cops!" the man hissed. He released Ben, grabbing his fallen partner. Together, they bolted through the back door, disappearing into the darkness. Ben slumped in his chair, gasping for breath. Moments later, officers burst into the house, guns drawn. "Are you okay, Mr. Carter?" one of them asked, his flashlight illuminating Ben's bruised face. Ben nodded weakly. They got away. Two men. Masks. "We'll secure the area," the officer assured him. "Paramedics are on their way." As the officers fanned out, Megan arrived, rushing into the house. Then she called, kneeling beside him. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was shaky. "They were looking for something, Megan. Something they didn't want me to have." Megan's eyes darkened. "The USB drive?" Ben nodded. "It's in my laptop, but we need to make copies. If they're willing to break in, they'll come back." Megan pulled out her own laptop and got to work, transferring the files while the police secured the house. Ben couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whoever was behind this wouldn't stop until they silenced him for good. The next day, Ben and Megan met with Detective Laura Briggs, one of the few officers Ben trusted. She was sharp, determined, and had shown an unusual interest in Emily's case from the start. "I reviewed the surveillance footage you sent me," Laura said, her expression grave. "There's enough here to reopen the investigation into Chief Grant, but it's going to ruffle some feathers. He had powerful allies." "That's an understatement," Ben muttered. "Someone sent those men to shut me up. They won't stop until I'm out of the picture." Laura nodded. "I'm assigning a patrol car to your house for protection. In the meantime, I need you to keep digging. Whoever sent that USB drive wants you to expose the truth, and I want to know why." As Ben and Megan left the station, a black SUV idled across the street. Its tinted windows made it impossible to see inside, but Ben felt its presence like a shadow. "Do you think they're watching us?" Megan asked, glancing nervously at the vehicle. Ben's jaw tightened. "Let them watch. They'll know I'm not giving up." But as they drove home, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The SUV seemed to appear in his rearview mirror at every turn, keeping its distance but never straying too far. That night, Ben stayed awake, clutching the stun gun and staring at the front door. The files were copied, the evidence mounting, but he knew the fight was far from over. And whoever was pulling the strings wasn't finished yet. Hours later, just as the sun began to rise, Ben's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're digging too deep. The next time, we won't miss." Ben stared at the message, the weight of the threat sinking in. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for his life. The text lingered on Ben's screen like a venomous snake, its threat coiled and ready to strike. He quickly forwarded the message to Detective Briggs, attaching a note. "They're watching me." His fingers trembled as he placed the phone on the desk. The morning light spilled through the window, but instead of bringing comfort, it only emphasized how exposed he felt. He wheeled himself to the window and peered outside. The black SUV was gone, but its absence felt even more ominous. A knock on the door startled him. His heart raced until he heard Megan's voice. "It's me, Ben. Let me in." He rolled over and unlocked the door. Megan entered, holding 2 coffees and a bag of pastries. She took one look at his face and frowned. "You didn't sleep, did you?" Ben shook his head. "They sent me another message. They're not backing down." Megan set the coffees on the table, her expression grim. "What did it say?" Ben handed her his phone. Megan read the text, her brow furrowing. "This isn't just a warning," she said. "It's a promise. They're making it clear they'll come for you again." "I can't let them scare me off," Ben said, his voice firm. "Emily deserves justice. And now that I know what these people are capable of, I'm not stopping until the truth is out." Megan nodded. "Then we need to be smarter. If they're watching you, we need to stay one step ahead." Later that day, Detective Briggs arrived with an update. "We traced the number that sent the text," she said. "It's a burner phone. No leads." Ben sighed. "Figures. What about the 2 men who broke in?" "No luck there, either," Briggs admitted. "The surveillance footage outside your house was wiped before we could pull it. Whoever we're dealing with has resources. That much is obvious," Ben muttered. Briggs leaned forward. "But we do have one lead. I followed up on that whistleblower Megan found. The officer who accused Grant of covering up evidence. His name is Alan Reed, and I tracked him down. He's living under an assumed name in a small town in Indiana." Ben straightened in his chair. "Can you arrange for me to meet him?" Briggs hesitated. "It's risky. If these people know about you, they might know about him too. We need to be careful." "I'll take the risk," Ben said firmly. "If he knows anything that can help, I need to hear it." Briggs nodded. "I'll make the arrangements. But you'll need to go quietly. No one can know where you're headed." That evening, Under the cover of darkness, Ben and Megan left for Indiana. Briggs had provided them with an unmarked car and explicit instructions. No phones, no credit cards, and no stops along the way. The journey was tense. Every car that followed them a potential threat. They arrived in a sleepy town just before midnight. Briggs had arranged for them to meet Alan Reed at a diner on the outskirts of town. The place was nearly empty, save for a waitress behind the counter and an older man in a booth by the window. "That must be him," Megan whispered. Ben wheeled himself over to the booth. The man looked up, his face lined with years of stress and regret. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and glanced nervously around the room. "Alan Reed?" Ben asked quietly. The man nodded. "You must be Carter," he said, his voice low. "And you brought a friend?" "This is Megan," Ben explained. "She's helping me." Reed sighed. "I don't know how much help I'll be. I've been out of the game for a long time. Whatever you know, we need to hear it," Ben pressed. "Grant might be gone, but his secrets aren't. We're trying to take down whoever's protecting him." Reed leaned back, his eyes scanning the room again. Grant was dirty, no question about it. But he wasn't working alone. There's a whole network of people, politicians, business owners, even other cops who benefited from his arrangements. I tried to expose it once, and it nearly cost me my life. Ben leaned in. "Do you have proof?" Reed hesitated. "I had some files, but they're gone. Taken during a break-in at my old apartment. I barely escaped with my life. Whoever's behind this, they don't leave loose ends." Megan frowned. "There has to be something. Anything we can use." Reed glanced at her, then back at Ben. "There's one thing. Before I left, I heard about a storage unit Grant used to keep his more sensitive items. Files, recordings, things he couldn't risk keeping at the station or his house. If it's still there, it might have what you're looking for." "Where is it?" Ben asked. "Edgewood Storage, just outside of Dayton," Reed said. "Unit 47B. But be careful. If they find out you're looking, they won't hesitate to take you out." As they left the diner, Ben's mind raced. The storage unit could be the key to unraveling everything, but it also painted a target on their backs. He and Megan drove back to their motel, both lost in thought. But as they pulled into the parking lot, their worst fears were realized. A black SUV was parked near their room, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Two figures leaned against the vehicle, watching them. "Ben," Megan whispered, her voice tight with fear. "They found us?" Ben's grip tightened on the armrest of his wheelchair. "Stay calm," he said, though his own heart was racing. "We need to get out of here now." Before they could reverse, the figures approached, their hands resting on the holsters of their guns. Megan's breath hitched as one of them knocked on her window. "Step out of the car," the man ordered, his voice cold and authoritative. Megan looked at Ben, her eyes wide with terror. Ben reached for the stun gun hidden under his seat, his mind racing for a way out. The men were closing in, and this time, escape seemed impossible. Ben's fingers tightened around the stun gun under his seat. His mind raced. He needed a plan, a way to buy time, distract them, or escape. Megan's panicked breathing beside him only made his urgency sharper. "Step out of the car," the man repeated, his tone more forceful. Ben looked at Megan, his voice low but steady. "When I say go, reverse as fast as you can." Her eyes darted to him, wide with fear. Ben slowly raised his hands, feigning compliance. All right. No need to make this messy." The man on Megan's side smirked. "Smart move, old man." Ben's heart pounded as he watched the second man approach his door. Timing was everything. As soon as the man leaned in to open the driver's side, Ben pressed the stun gun to his wrist and fired. The crackle of electricity was deafening, and the man crumpled with a groan. "Go!" Ben shouted. Megan slammed the car into reverse. The tires screeched, throwing the second man off balance. The SUV behind them loomed closer, but Megan veered hard to the right, avoiding it by inches. Ben reached over and yanked the wheel, guiding them toward the motel exit. Gunshots rang out, shattering the back window. Megan screamed, but Ben barked, "Keep going. Don't stop." The car sped onto the main road, the engine whining under the strain. In the rearview mirror, Ben saw the SUV roar to life, its headlights blazing as it gave chase. "They're following us," Megan cried. Ben looked around, scanning the dark road for any advantage. "Turn onto the next side street," he said. "We need to lose them." Megan swerved onto a narrow street lined with abandoned warehouses. The SUV's headlights grew closer, its engine a low growl in the distance. Ben spotted a sharp turn ahead and pointed. "There, pull in and kill the lights." Megan obeyed, turning into an alley and cutting the engine. The car fell silent, hidden in the shadows. Both of them held their breath as the SUV thundered past, its occupants oblivious to their hiding spot. For several tense minutes, they sat in silence, waiting to see if the men would double back. Finally, Megan exhaled shakily. "That was too close?" Ben nodded, his grip on the stun gun relaxing slightly. "We're not out of the woods yet. We need to get to the storage unit before they realize where we're headed." By the time they reached Edgewood Storage, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The facility was eerily quiet, its rows of metal units stretching into the distance. Ben and Megan parked outside the gate and approached on foot, using a set of bolt cutters Megan had swiped from her car trunk. "Unit 47B," Megan whispered, scanning the numbers on the doors. "This way." They found the unit tucked near the back of the lot. The padlock was heavy and rusted, but the bolt cutters made quick work of it. Megan glanced around nervously as she swung the door open. "Let's make this fast." The unit was cluttered with boxes, filing cabinets, and old furniture. Dust hung in the air, and the faint smell of mildew made Ben's nose wrinkle. He wheeled himself inside, his eyes scanning for anything useful. Megan rifled through a filing cabinet, pulling out folders and photos. "These are old case files," she said. "Some of them have Grant's name on them." Ben rolled over to a stack of boxes and pried one open. Inside were audio tapes, each labeled with dates and initials. He recognized some of the names. Witnesses who had recanted their statements, officers who had retired under suspicious circumstances. "This is it," Ben said, his voice trembling. "This is the proof we need." Megan pulled out her phone to take pictures, but Ben shook his head. "No phones. They might be tracking us." She nodded, stuffing the files into a backpack. "Let's grab as much as we can and go." Suddenly, the sound of tires crunching gravel broke the silence. Megan froze. "Ben, someone's here." Ben strained to hear. The low rumble of an engine grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable beam of headlights sweeping across the lot. His stomach twisted. "They found us." Megan darted to the door and peeked outside. "It's the SUV. Same one from the motel." Ben's mind raced. They couldn't afford to be cornered again. "Close the door. Lock it from the inside." She hesitated but complied, sliding the heavy door shut and wedging a metal bar through the handle. The unit plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of Megan's flashlight. The SUV stopped just outside, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the stillness. Ben and Megan held their breath as shadows passed in front of the thin slits in the door. "They're in there," a voice said, low and threatening. "Then let's smoke them out," another replied. A loud bang echoed through the unit as something slammed against the door. Ben's chest tightened. They were trapped, and the men outside weren't planning to let them walk away this time. Megan grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" Ben clenched his jaw, determination burning in his eyes. "We fight." Another bang rocked the door, followed by the sound of something being poured. The acrid smell of gasoline seeped through the cracks. Ben's stomach dropped as the realization hit him. They were going to burn them alive. The sharp scent of gasoline filled the storage unit, making Ben's throat tighten and his eyes water. He gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his mind racing. The banging on the door stopped, replaced by muffled voices outside. "They're lighting it," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. Ben clenched his jaw. "We can't wait here. Help me look for another way out." The beam from Megan's flashlight swept across the room, illuminating every corner. The walls were solid metal, the only other opening a small ventilation grate near the back. "There," Ben pointed. "If we can unscrew the grate, we can crawl out." Megan rushed over, fumbling with the screws. It's rusted shut. Look for something sharp, Ben urged, scanning the clutter around him. He grabbed a crowbar from a pile of tools and rolled over to help. Together, they pried at the grate, the metal groaning under their efforts. Outside, voices rose. "Do it already," one of the men shouted. A faint flicker of orange light glowed through the slits in the door. The unmistakable sound of a match being struck sent a chill down Ben's spine. "Hurry, Megan," he urged. With a final heave, the grate popped loose. The opening was narrow, but just wide enough for them to squeeze through. Megan crawled out first, pulling Ben's wheelchair after her. She grabbed his arms, helping him maneuver through the gap, his legs dragging awkwardly behind him. As they emerged into the cool night air, the flames inside the unit roared to life. Smoke billowed through the cracks, curling into the sky. Megan shoved the wheelchair upright and helped Ben into it just as the two men spotted them. "They're out," one of them shouted, drawing a pistol. "Run!" Ben yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. Megan pushed the wheelchair with all her strength, darting behind another row of storage units. Bullets whizzed past them, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing in the lot. They zigzagged through the maze of units, the men's shouts and heavy footsteps close behind. Ben's heart pounded as they reached the edge of the facility, where a chain-link fence loomed. "We're trapped," Megan gasped, panic in her voice. Ben scanned the area, his eyes landing on a stack of wooden pallets leaning against the fence. "There, use the pallets to climb over." Megan hesitated. "What about you?" "Don't worry about me," Ben snapped. "Get over and call for help." Reluctantly, Megan began climbing, her hands trembling as she scaled the fence. The men rounded the corner just as she dropped to the other side. "There!" one of them shouted. Ben wheeled himself forward, throwing the crowbar with all his might. It struck the man's hand, sending the gun clattering to the ground. The distraction was enough for Megan to disappear into the shadows. "You're going to pay for that," the second man growled, advancing on Ben. Ben clenched his fists, his breath steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "Come and get me." The man lunged, but Ben was ready. He yanked the stun gun from his lap and fired, the electric crackle lighting up the night. The man screamed, collapsing in a heap. The second man hesitated, glancing between his partner and Ben. Before he could act, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Red and blue lights flashed over the fence as police cars screeched to a halt outside the lot. The man cursed under his breath, grabbing his fallen partner and dragging him away. Ben slumped in his wheelchair, relief washing over him as the police poured into the facility. An hour later, Ben and Megan sat in the back of an ambulance, blankets draped over their shoulders. Detective Briggs stood nearby, her arms crossed as she listened to their account of what had happened. "You're lucky to be alive," Briggs said, her tone firm but tinged with admiration. "If those men had succeeded, we wouldn't have found anything but ashes." "They're getting desperate," Ben said, his voice hoarse. "They know we're close?" Briggs nodded. "We recovered some of the files from the storage unit, but most of it was destroyed in the fire." "Do you still have the USB drive?" Ben patted his pocket, where the drive was safely tucked away. "It's all here, and I'm not stopping until every name on those files is exposed." Briggs sighed. "Be careful, Ben. Whoever's behind this won't hesitate to escalate. I'll assign additional protection, but you need to stay out of sight." Ben met her gaze, his expression steely. "I didn't back down tonight, and I won't back down tomorrow." They can't silence the truth. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle began to pull away, Ben glanced at Megan. Her face was pale, but her eyes held the same determination. "We're not done yet," he said. Megan nodded. "Not even close." But as they disappeared into the night, a figure watched from the shadows, a phone pressed to their ear. "They got away," the figure said, their voice low. "But don't worry, I'll handle it." The call ended, and the figure melted into the darkness, leaving behind a chilling sense of foreboding. The safe house Detective Briggs arranged for Ben and Megan was small and sparsely furnished, nestled in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Dayton. The blinds were drawn, and an unmarked patrol car idled outside, manned by two plainclothes officers. Despite the sense of security, Ben couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He sat at the dining table, the USB drive in front of him. Megan paced the room, her nerves evident. "What's our next move?" she asked, breaking the tense silence. Ben tapped the drive with his finger. "We go through everything on here. If we can find a direct link to whoever's running this operation, we can force the authorities to act." Megan stopped pacing and nodded. "Let's do it." Ben plugged the drive into his laptop, and the familiar folder labeled Truth appeared on the screen. They worked in silence, sifting through the videos, audio files, and documents. The deeper they dug, the clearer the picture became. Chief Grant had been part of a sprawling network of corruption that reached into every corner of the city. Politicians, business executives, even judges. But the most damning revelation was buried in a series of emails. "Here," Ben said, leaning forward. The email chain detailed payments made to various officials to suppress evidence in high-profile cases. The sender was identified only as Spectre. "Spectre," Megan repeated. "What kind of name is that?" "Probably an alias," Ben said, frowning. "But look at this." He pointed to one email in particular, which included a list of recipients. One name stood out: Judge Charles Peterson. "The same judge from the trial?" Megan asked, her voice rising. Ben nodded grimly. "He's not just a bystander. He's part of this." Megan stared at the screen, disbelief etched on her face. "He was the one reviewing the photo you brought to court. If he's in on it, he probably planned to dismiss it." Ben's mind raced. "If we can link Peterson to Spectre, we might be able to expose the whole network." As they worked late into the night, Megan's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Briggs. It was a photo of a black sedan parked outside the police station. "We think it's connected to the people after you. Be on alert." Megan showed the text to Ben, her face pale. "They're still looking for us." Ben nodded, his jaw tightening. "Good. That means they're scared." But the reprieve was short-lived. A loud crash shattered the silence as the front window exploded inward. Glass rained down, and a tear gas canister rolled across the floor, hissing violently. "Down!" Ben shouted, covering his face with his arm. Megan grabbed his wheelchair and pushed him toward the back door, coughing as the gas filled the room. Another crash came from the back of the house. Heavy footsteps pounded against the floorboards as the intruders stormed inside. "They're here!" Megan gasped. Ben gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "The USB drive. We can't let them take it." He yanked the drive from the laptop and shoved it into his pocket. Megan grabbed a metal lamp from the corner of the room, holding it like a weapon. "We're not going down without a fight," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. The first man appeared in the doorway, a shadowy figure wearing a gas mask. Megan swung the lamp with all her strength, catching him across the head. He staggered but didn't fall, raising his arm to strike back. Ben wheeled forward and jabbed the stun gun into the man's side, sending him crumpling to the floor. "We need to get out of here," Ben shouted. Megan grabbed his chair, pushing him toward the back door. But before they could reach it, another man blocked their path. He raised a gun, aiming directly at Ben. "You've caused enough trouble," the man growled. "Hand over the drive, or I'll put a bullet in both of you." Ben stared at him, defiant. "If you want it, you'll have to take it off my body." The man's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, a deafening roar filled the room. A patrol officer burst in, his gun blazing. The intruder fell with a grunt, his weapon clattering to the floor. "Move! Now!" the officer barked, covering them as they fled through the back door. Megan pushed Ben into the alley behind the house, where a second officer waited by a patrol car. "Get in," the officer shouted, opening the rear door. Ben and Megan scrambled inside, the USB drive still clutched in Ben's hand. As the car sped away, flames engulfed the safe house, the fire consuming any traces of their presence. Hours later, they sat in the back of a different safe house, this one in a more secure location arranged by Briggs. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt wood and adrenaline. "That was too close," Megan said, her voice trembling. "They're not just trying to scare us anymore. They want us dead." Ben nodded, his eyes hard. "And we can't stop now. If we give up..." Detective Briggs entered the room, her face set in a grim expression. "The men who attacked the house, they're not locals. We traced them to a private security firm that's been implicated in illegal operations before. They're mercenaries? Mercenaries? Megan echoed, her eyes widening. Hired by who? Briggs hesitated. That's what we're trying to figure out. But one thing's clear. They're desperate to silence you. We need to move fast. Ben placed the USB drive on the table, his voice steady. Then let's make sure the whole world knows what they're trying to hide. Briggs nodded, her jaw tightening. We'll need to find a secure way to release this. Once it's out, there's no turning back. Ben leaned forward, determination etched into every line of his face. Then let's finish this. But as they planned their next move, the same shadowy figure from before sat in a darkened office, speaking into a phone. They've survived again, the figure said, their voice cold and detached. Activate Plan B. This ends tonight. The night was eerily quiet at the new safe house. The windows were reinforced, the perimeter guarded, and the tension inside was palpable. Ben, Megan, and Detective Briggs huddled around a table, reviewing the contents of the USB drive again. Every file they unearthed added another piece to the puzzle, but the deeper they delved, the more dangerous it became. Briggs pointed to an encrypted folder on the drive. This could be the jackpot, she said. If we can crack it, we might find out who Spectre really is. Ben nodded. Then we don't have a choice. We need someone who can decrypt it. I know a guy, Megan said hesitantly. But he's not exactly conventional. Briggs raised an eyebrow. We don't have time to vet anyone. Trust me, Megan insisted. If anyone can do it, it's him. 2 hours later, they were driving down a desolate road toward an old industrial park. Megan had made a single phone call, and the response was cryptic but clear. Bring it here. No questions. The building was a decaying shell of its former self, graffiti and broken windows giving it an air of abandonment. Inside, however, was a different story. Rows of computers and monitors lit up the dark space, and a lanky man with thick glasses greeted them with a nervous energy. Megan, he exclaimed, pulling her into an awkward hug. I was starting to think you forgot about me. Elliot, we don't have time for pleasantries, Megan said, pulling away. We need your help. Elliot glanced at Ben and Briggs, his gaze lingering on Ben's wheelchair. What kind of trouble are you dragging me into this time? The kind that gets people killed, Ben said bluntly, placing the USB drive on the table. Can you decrypt this or not? Elliot frowned, clearly intrigued. I'll need a few hours. Encryption like this doesn't crack itself. Work fast, Briggs said. We're running out of time. Elliot nodded, diving into his work. The room was filled with the hum of machines and the clatter of keys as he worked to break through the layers of encryption. As the hours passed, Ben's unease grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had been followed, despite the precautions they'd taken. He wheeled himself to a window, peering out into the darkness. The industrial park was deserted, but the quiet felt unnatural. Suddenly, the faint sound of tires crunching gravel reached his ears. Ben's stomach dropped. Megan, he said, his voice low. We got company? She rushed to his side, looking out. A convoy of black SUVs was approaching, their headlights off. They found us, Briggs muttered, reaching for her weapon. We need to get out of here. Elliot spun around, panic flashing across his face. Get out? I'm not done yet. You don't have a choice, Ben snapped. Save what you've got, and let's move. Elliot scrambled to pull a portable hard drive from his setup, transferring the files as quickly as he could. Outside, the SUVs came to a stop, and figures in tactical gear began fanning out. Briggs turned to Megan. Help him move his equipment. Ben, stay close to me. The first gunshot shattered the tension. The bullet ricocheted off a metal support beam, sending everyone diving for cover. They're coming in, Megan shouted. Briggs returned fire, her aim precise and controlled. Move now, she barked. Ben wheeled himself toward the back exit, Megan and Elliot close behind. The sound of gunfire and shouting filled the air as the attackers closed in. Elliot clutched the hard drive to his chest, his face pale with terror. Out the back! Briggs yelled, covering their escape. The group burst through the rear door, emerging into an alley behind the building. A black SUV screeched around the corner, cutting them off. Two men jumped out, guns raised. Ben acted on instinct, jabbing his stun gun into one of the men as he reached for him. The man crumpled, but the second raised his weapon. Before he could fire, Megan swung a heavy metal pipe she'd picked up, striking him in the arm. The gun clattered to the ground as the man yelled in pain. "Keep moving," Ben shouted. They darted through the industrial park, weaving between rusted machinery and piles of debris. The sound of the attackers pursuing them grew louder. "This way," Briggs called, leading them to a drainage tunnel. The group slipped inside, the narrow space forcing them to crouch as they moved. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the air was damp and musty. Elliot gasped for breath, his hands trembling. "This is insane. You didn't tell me I'd be running for my life." "You wanted adventure," Megan shot back. "Welcome to it." Briggs stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. "Quiet," she whispered. The faint sound of footsteps echoed behind them. They weren't alone. Ben's grip tightened on his stun gun as shadows appeared at the tunnel entrance. Briggs raised her weapon, her finger hovering over the trigger. "Get out of here," she said, her voice low but commanding. "I'll hold them off." "No way," Ben said. "We stick together." "You'll slow me down," Briggs snapped. "I need you to keep moving. Find a way to expose this." Megan hesitated, torn. "Briggs, go!" Briggs barked. Reluctantly, Megan pushed Ben forward, leading Elliot deeper into the tunnel. Behind them, gunfire erupted as Briggs engaged the attackers. "Briggs won't make it," Elliot said, his voice shaking. "She'll buy us time," Ben said firmly. "We need to make it count." They emerged from the tunnel into a wooded area, the morning light just beginning to creep over the horizon. Megan pulled out her phone, dialing a number. "Who are you calling?" Ben asked. "The press," Megan said, her voice resolute. "If they're going to kill us, we're going to make sure the world knows why." Ben nodded, the USB drive in his pocket feeling heavier than ever. Their fight wasn't over, but they were closer to the truth and the danger than they had ever been before. The trees around them were thick, casting deep shadows as Ben, Megan, and Elliot moved quickly through the woods. They had no idea if the mercenaries were still on their trail, but the sense of urgency pressed on them like a heavy weight. They couldn't afford to stop, not even for a second. Megan led the way, her eyes scanning the darkened path ahead. Ben's mind raced. They had the proof, but getting it out, there was another battle altogether. The government could be compromised, the media might be silenced, and the mercenaries would keep coming until they were either dead or discredited. He was beginning to realize just how deep the conspiracy went. "We need to get to the nearest town," Megan said, breaking the silence. "Once we're out of here, we can make the call to the press." Elliot, struggling to keep up, panted behind them. "And what? Hope that someone listens to us." Megan turned to him. "We don't have a choice, Elliot. We either take the risk and expose this, or we die with the truth buried." Ben gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his jaw set. He couldn't afford to be scared now. "She's right," he said, his voice steady. "We can't let them win. Not after everything they've done." Elliot was silent for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's get this over with." They reached a small town about an hour later. Megan had managed to get through to an investigative journalist named Leo Turner, who had been covering political corruption for years. He had agreed to meet them at an old diner on the edge of town. Ben, Megan, and Elliot took the back roads, hoping to avoid any unwanted attention. The last thing they needed was to walk straight into another ambush. As they pulled up to the diner, Ben noticed the lights were dim inside. It was early morning, and the place looked deserted except for one person sitting in a booth near the back. Leo Turner was an older man, graying at the temples, his expression tense but professional. Megan walked in first, her steps quick and purposeful. Ben followed, keeping a sharp eye out for anyone suspicious. Elliot took up the rear, still clutching the portable hard drive with the encrypted files. Leo stood up when they approached, his gaze flicking to Ben in his wheelchair before focusing on Megan. "You must be Megan," he said, his voice gravelly. "I got your message. What's this all about?" Megan took a seat at the table, placing the hard drive in front of him. "We've got proof of a massive cover-up involving Chief Grant, Judge Peterson, and a whole lot of people with blood on their hands. We need you to get this out. Now." Leo didn't immediately touch the drive. Instead, he stared at it, his face unreadable. And what's in it for you? I've seen plenty of people willing to throw away their lives for something like this. You really think I'm going to risk my career on a hunch? Ben wheeled forward, his voice steady. I don't expect you to believe us without proof. But the people we're up against don't care who they hurt. They've already tried to kill us, and they'll stop at nothing to cover their tracks. We just need you to make sure this doesn't die with us. Leo finally reached for the hard drive, his fingers pausing over it. And you want me to release it to the public? Just like that? Yes, Megan said. If you don't, we're all dead. Leo's face hardened as he looked at the drive. You're playing a dangerous game, kid. The people you're dealing with, they don't care about your life. They'll make sure everyone connected to this gets buried. Ben leaned in, his voice cold. Then we need to make sure they don't have the chance to bury us. We'll make sure the world knows who they are. And we'll use everything we have to make sure no one can sweep this under the rug. Leo sighed, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. All right, I'll need a few hours to go through this. And once I release it, there's no going back. Megan nodded. We know. Ben looked out the diner's window, watching as a black SUV pulled into the parking lot across the street. He recognized it immediately. The same men who had been hunting them. They found us, Ben muttered. Megan's eyes widened. How? We were careful. Doesn't matter now, Ben said, already turning to the door. We've got to move. They didn't even have time to grab their coats. Ben, Megan, and Elliot bolted from the diner, pushing through the back door and into the alleyway. The sound of footsteps followed them, quick and determined. There was no escape by car this time. Too many eyes on the street. We need a place to hide, Megan said, her voice urgent. Ben scanned the area. The alley stretched for a few hundred feet, but there was nowhere to hide, no time to think. They needed a distraction, something to buy them just a few more seconds. As they turned the corner, they spotted a small, dilapidated building with an open door. In there! Ben shouted. They darted inside, closing the door behind them. The building was empty, save for some discarded furniture and boxes. The silence was deafening, but it didn't last long. The door slammed open, and the same men who had been following them stepped inside. They raised their guns immediately. Move! One of them shouted. We know you've got the drive. Hand it over. Megan, breathing heavily, stepped in front of Ben, holding her hands up. We're not giving you anything. You've already tried to kill us. What more do you want? Your lives, the second man replied coldly, stepping forward. The drive or your death? Ben's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned. There was no way they could win this fight. Unless... Elliot, Ben said, his voice barely a whisper. Do you have the backup? Elliot's eyes flicked to Ben, confused. What backup? Ben nodded toward the hard drive. The moment we gave you the drive, we backed up everything to a cloud server. As long as the data's out there, it doesn't matter if they kill us. They can't erase it. Elliot's face paled. You did what? Ben looked back at the men, his voice steady. The moment you try to kill us, it's all over for you. You can't get to us, and you can't get to the truth. The leader of the mercenaries smirked, glancing at his partner. You're too late. He raised his gun, but before he could fire, the sound of multiple gunshots rang out. The two men collapsed to the floor, their weapons falling from their hands. From the doorway stood a familiar figure, Detective Briggs. You really thought I'd let you take them? She said coolly. Now, let's get that drive to the right people before anyone else gets the idea that they can stop us. Ben exhaled sharply, his body still tense from the close call. I thought you were done for. Briggs gave a dry smile. You can't get rid of me that easily. Megan stepped forward, her eyes wide. You saved us? Briggs nodded, her expression darkening. This is far from over. But now it's time to end it for good. As they moved out of the building, the first rays of daylight pierced the sky. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in weeks, Ben felt like they might just win this fight. The truth was out, and no one could stop it now. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the city. But for Ben, Megan, Elliot, and Detective Briggs, the weight of the truth was the only thing that mattered now. The danger wasn't over, but they had managed to deliver the final blow. The encrypted files on the USB drive, now in the hands of the authorities, were already making waves. The media, once silenced by threats and bribes, were finally getting the truth about Chief Grant, Judge Peterson, and the vast network of corruption that had held the city in its grip for so long. As they drove toward the safe house once again, Ben's heart pounded. Not from fear this time, but from the realization that their battle had sparked something bigger. The wheels of justice, slow and often obstructed, had begun to turn, and the city was waking up to the reality of what had been hidden for so long. "We did it," Megan said quietly, her eyes watching the road ahead. She was exhausted, but the relief in her voice was unmistakable. Ben nodded. "We didn't just do it for us. We did it for Emily, for everyone who's been silenced." Elliot, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since their narrow escape, looked over at Ben. "Do you think this will really change anything?" he asked, his voice unsure. "It already has," Ben replied. "The truth is out, and no matter how hard they try, they can't take that back." As they pulled into the safe house, Briggs received a call. She stepped outside to speak in private, her face unreadable. Ben, Megan, and Elliot waited anxiously inside. It felt like an eternity before she returned, her face calm, but with a glint of determination in her eyes. "It's official," she said, her voice steady. "The FBI's taking over the investigation. They've already started arresting people connected to the network. Grant's gone into hiding, but it won't be long before they catch him. Peterson's been taken into custody, and the charges are already piling up." Ben exhaled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. He had spent months in the grip of anger and fear, but now, as he heard the news, a flicker of peace began to settle in. "Do you think they'll stop?" Megan asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Briggs shook her head. "They'll keep trying. But now, they're on the run. They're scared. And when you're scared, you make mistakes." "We've won the first round," Ben said. "And that's all that matters. We've shown them they can't control everything." The door opened behind them, and a man in a suit stepped into the room. He introduced himself as Agent Miller from the FBI. "We're going to need your help to tie up loose ends," he said, shaking their hands. "But everything you've done has put us ahead of the curve." Ben and Megan exchanged a glance, a quiet understanding passing between them. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but this was the first step. And for the first time in months, Ben could imagine a future where the darkness didn't always win. The next few weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, interviews, and the relentless pursuit of justice. More arrests were made. The network of corruption unraveled, and each day brought new revelations about the depth of the conspiracy. But even as the wheels of justice began to grind forward, the constant threat of retaliation loomed. One night, as Ben sat at his desk, reviewing the latest updates, a knock on the door startled him. It was Megan. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Ben looked up, his expression tired but resolute. "Just thinking about everything." Megan sat down beside him. "You're not done yet, are you?" "No," Ben said, shaking his head. "But I will be. Not until every last person involved in this is held accountable." Megan smiled, though there was sadness in her eyes. "I get it, but don't forget to take care of yourself, too. You've been fighting for so long. You deserve a break." Ben looked at her, his lips twitching into a small smile. "Maybe, but the fight's not over yet. I'll rest when I know we've taken them down for good." As the night wore on, the phone rang one last time, a call from Agent Miller. "We got them, Ben. The last of them. We couldn't have done it without you." Ben exhaled, the weight of the battle finally lifting from his chest. "It's over," he whispered, though part of him still couldn't believe it. The conspiracy was dead. The truth had been exposed. And in the end, despite the danger, despite the fear, Ben had won. Not just for Emily, not just for him, but for everyone who had been silenced. The justice they had fought for was real, and the power of truth had prevailed. As he looked out the window at the first rays of dawn breaking over the city, Ben finally allowed himself to breathe. The darkness was receding, and in its place, there was hope. Hope that even in the darkest corners, light could still break through.